This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay. Hi everyone, we're in week 4. You might wonder why I pause before I start sometimes, even if I'm ready. There's a little button here that says preparing to record, and when it says recording, I begin talking. So if you wondered why I'm about 4 or 5 minutes late each time, just in case. So I'm one of those people that worries about starting on time. So let's have a little recap, because I hope at this time that you're starting to get the feel of the subject, that you're starting to get in the routine of what studying for this subject, amongst the other things that I assume you're doing, to imagine what that looks like. So it's probably worth just having a moment of pause before I charge into the next bit. So remember, in week 1, we kind of drew this map, a bit of a messy map, but an overview map of what the planning system roughly has in it, and these main processes that we're going to focus on, and thinking that as you go through, we hope that all starts to fit together for you, and we'll test you on that at the end, not in an assessed way, but to put it together. Hopefully all that fits together, and if you need to, you can say, oh, I don't quite get that bit, or whatever it might take. So you've been reading Stephen Rowley's excellent book that provides a different but hopefully complementary process behind the scenes. If you're not doing that, you might find it kind of challenging to get the wider view or a different contextual perspective of the subject, so please keep reading as you move through. And of course, in the background, you've got worksheets. I've given you 2 worksheets at this stage. I last night prepared worksheet 3, but I didn't issue it on the LMS because I would like you to make sure that you start assignment 1 first. So next week, I'll release that worksheet to sequence things out. And we had a little bit of a contextual moment thinking about metropolitan planning last week, and I assume from everything I've heard from the tutors that you are now starting to work on assignment 1, and that you have a bit of a sense of why we've got these 3 components to the assignment, which go through the rules in part 1, the context of a place and understanding the real world the real world context of change and dynamics that sometimes are part of planning and sometimes are just the real world of property and development and architecture and property rights and etc. And then part 3, to think about what that all means together. Very common, very useful skills, in fact, in the built environment professions. And we had a bit of a think, for those of you who are new to this area, about drawings in a fairly simple but hopefully useful way. So tonight we're looking at local planning and implementation. It's a bit of an information session in some ways, but please consider it in context of these key processes which I'll roll out to you in week 5, that's next week, which are about how planning permit processes work. I've deliberately separated them out a little bit from the amendment process so they don't get too mixed up in your mind. So make sure you get the basics of the amendment process, thinking that next week we're going to look at the planning permit process. If you go into practice in planning or a related field, I would guess that most of you will work in planning permit processes or some related area. It's the bread and butter of work in the planning system. it's a fantastic thing to be on top of, because then you get to think about all the other stuff. It could be, Matt, you're a contortionist. It could be, I should charge people money to see that. I want to see next week if you can go up 3 rows. It contextualises so much of what happens in the planning system, and we can have all the big strategic processes in the world, but it comes down to this statutory process of knowing what zones and overlays and typical processes mean in the context of amendments. So, that's where we're at. You'll note here for next week I'll hand out worksheet 3, and if I get through it, worksheet 4. Otherwise it'll come a couple of days later. Please note that the Easter break is the week following week 5. Okay, so I just point that out because not everyone might be fully across that. So let's go into that one. Any questions about that sort of broad picture that I've just described of how we're moving through the semester at this stage? I know that you've got tutors to work with and to talk about detail with, but any broader stuff? Roll up, roll up. Okay, I'll take that as a resounding happiness with where we're going. Happiness is too big a word, I know. So, operations of local planning schemes. I deliberately set this context out thinking that, yes, while the planning permit process consumes huge amounts of energy and time, actually there's a fair bit going on in the use of day-to-day planning schemes that is not just the permits themselves. So we're going to take a broad view of this before we charge in a bit more detail to permitting next week. And remembering, we've got this basic division in planning. Now this division exists across all planning schemes across the world, but we call them certain things here. The plan making bit, which is generally number 1, and this is a particular type of plan making, a statutory plan making, and part 2, which is administering the planning scheme, or what in other contexts might be called implementation. So this is, I hope you recognise, a necessarily quite narrow view of implementation, acknowledging that the Victorian, and in fact most planning systems in Australia most of the time, tend to see implementation as planning permit processes. If you go to other places, you will find it can be quite different. Netherlands, Germany, etc., where things happen in slightly different ways. So it's important to keep the system we're thinking about here in context, but largely the most impact of planning, where it touches the ground, is when we say you can get a permit or you can't, or you can if you do these other things. And indeed that's where most of the budget of local governments goes to. So thinking, just a reminder back to last week and the week before, what are amendments? They're these processes of changing the background rules. It's an important thing to do. It might add or take away or modify the ability to develop on land economically, or indeed in many other measures of the value of land. And thinking also that the way planning scheme amendments occur is not in isolation, but within the context of state planning policy and the VPPs. So it's a bit of a tricky space to work in, because you've got to show that, yes, this rezoning fits in with state policy as well as local government, and as well as being appropriate to that site. And it's one of the features of planning in Victoria that those constraints have a huge influence, for good and bad outcomes, I would say. So the big driver behind all of this, and I would encourage you to know the link back into the Act, the Planning and Environment Act, that dictates what should be in a planning scheme, the VPPs and who can change it, is to think about the nature of what a planning authority can do and what it can't do. So there will be a lot of political value and meaning in this for different people, depending on perhaps your political views or your views on local democracy, or in fact what role that you play. So of course the Minister has this overarching ability to change the VPPs. It's not all powerful, but he or she can modify the VPPs, and they can issue ministerial directions. So if you looked at worksheet number 2, you would have understood that there are these directions that come down and they modify things about what we can do. For example, if there's contaminated land, or the form and content of planning schemes, and so forth, or the review process. And if we have a look at the state planning and policy framework, it's set at the state level by the government of the day through the Minister for Planning. And on one hand, local government might be very upset that they can't do whatever they like in their planning scheme, and they sometimes complain bitterly, and it becomes a political wrangle that they have not got autonomy to achieve local goals. On the other hand, the role of the Minister as the government of the day is to make sure that local planning schemes fit in with state policy and statewide direction. And it might be sharing around development or sharing around some of the burdens of urban planning, making sure that growth is equally distributed across the state. And some of these things, you know, you can imagine how you might do it. Others are pretty challenging. You can't force developers to build somewhere, but you can, through the VPPs and the SPF in particular, highly encourage local government to provide opportunities for growth in their municipalities, particularly with Plan Melbourne seriously needing to identify sites and places for further growth to accommodate all of this growth of numbers of population that we have. And if you've looked at the newspapers over the last 3 days, a debate that's been bubbling away for ages has surfaced, and I think Sunday and today the editorial commentary directly talked about whether or not immigration can continue in the form it has over the last nearly 50 years in Australia. And the planning system has all kinds of things to do with that, in terms of providing places for people to live and where they live and what form and height and, you know, all of these things that it's going to be part of. So it's an incredibly contemporary and important debate for us right now. And it cuts across all kinds of other questions about economic growth and not just immigration, welfare, and you name it. So big set of debates, and you may well think about looking at local newspapers like The Age to get examples of how these big questions of the day are dealt with through one of the planning mechanisms, which is the statutory processes that we have as our main focus here. If we continue to have immigration at the rates we have now, and we have a planning system through these statutory processes that doesn't accommodate growth, what's going to happen to housing? The system will fall down effectively. Costs will go through the roof. People won't want to come to Australia. All of these questions are, you know, hugely significant. So even though we try and stay within the rules and we try and be technical in some sense, these rules in the planning provisions have huge amounts of meaning. So state planning policies are set at state level for these big high-level goals. We have an opportunity for local government through the local planning policy framework to talk about their own municipality, how it's changing and what their goals are, but it still must fit into the SPPF and all the standardised zones and provisions in the rest of the planning scheme. So there's actually less scope for local government's autonomy than one imagines the further you go into it. Then the zones and overlays that we choose from, where do they come from? if I want to choose a certain zone for a bit of land in my municipality, maybe it's the City of Yarra, where do I choose the zones from? I suddenly changed phase there and asked a question, didn't I? Slightly unsettling. I do it on purpose. Can I choose my own zone that I made up on Sunday after lunch? So where am I choosing the zones from? I can't quite hear. I can hear murmuring. VPPs, exactly. The municipality in which I work might choose certain schedules, it might choose between zones, but the choice is really quite limited. So, you know, it's worth thinking about what that means and the good and bad things about that. We've had a strong drive for about 30 years in Victoria, and in fact it occurs across Australia, to standardise, homogenise and simplify the zones, even while the planning scheme got thicker and thicker and all these other complications were in there. So it's worth thinking about how well that works, and the fact that most local authorities are finding lots of workarounds to try and deal with that. So we've got these standard zones and overlays. Then we've got general and particular provisions. There's no modification to those. The definitions are standardised, and incorporated documents. Who knows what incorporated documents are? Say again? Like the appendix? Kind of, yeah. So I'll work with that. They're an appendix insofar as they're part of the planning scheme. Some of them are standard, like the provisions to do with carnivals and circuses and beekeeping and things like this, because they sort of attach into the planning scheme and they provide guidance about how to deal with certain uses and activities. And others are particular to the place and can be deliberately attached to the planning scheme. For example, a heritage study, obviously that belongs to a place and they might go through individual buildings or precincts and deal with that. And that document becomes incorporated. It gets additional standing, but it must be in some way, it only has so much power because it only informs the use of the standard zones and overlays, like the heritage overlay. And you might be seeking to work out, well, how significant is this building? And you'll go to the incorporated document, and it might be a study of historical buildings in a certain precinct in the City of Melbourne, and you use that to inform your assessment about whether or not we're allowed to knock it down or modify it or so forth. They're incorporated into the planning scheme because it gives them greater standing. It means they've been assessed. And how would you change the planning scheme to incorporate a document? It's not a quick question. There's two main processes that we use in Victoria all the time. Which one would it be? It's a scheme amendment. So if it has been incorporated into the planning scheme, it means that it's been considered, the quality of the study has been assessed, and it means it has a level of quality to it that would meaningfully inform a decision. It's not all of the information that goes in. But one of the problems with incorporated documents is that sometimes you can't even find them because they're not actually physically in the text that you download. A lot of the heritage overlay information that is held in a study about heritage is notoriously hard to find. Nowadays it's getting a lot easier because, you know, if the council just keeps some PDFs, but even then it's kind of challenging. Okay, so really what I'm trying to incite in you is to think about the mechanisms that we use for planning here in Victoria, and how this idea of having a blueprint or a template behind the scenes has many, many implications of good and bad types, often depending on who you are and what you're trying to do within the system. So continue to think about that as we go through, and I can assure you in the exam I will want to know that you can think about that meaningfully. And just a reminder, we've got two main processes for this scheme amendments. One is the standard amendment. We're using that 99% of the time, all these complicated steps that come out of the Act. Then we've got the amendments undertaken by the Minister, which one might call extraordinary amendments, usually using 20 Part 4 powers, or Section 20 Part 4. What does it mean if I say section, etc.? What's a section number indicate? What's the head of power for a section? It's from the Act, and in our case, the Planning and Environment Act most of the time. Often it's from the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunals Act. And what does it usually mean when I say a clause number? Where's that derived from? Planning scheme, okay. I'm deliberately sort of labouring these a little bit, make it second nature, and it saves you a lot of problems. Okay, so 20 Part 4, you've got the opportunity. It doesn't always change all the planning schemes, but the Minister might. It could be to introduce a new zone, to change a definition, you name it. And the Minister has a lot of ability to introduce far-ranging changes to the planning scheme should they see fit to do so. And it has a limited number of steps. It comes down to the Minister, and it seems kind of brutal in some ways, but on the other hand, the Minister is an elected member of a government that is in power democratically in a given moment. And this is part of government being able to prosecute and act on the policy that they seek to bring into being. Okay, so planning schemes. It's the actual administration of a planning scheme. This is where the powerhouse of the planning system, the most forceful thing a planning system can actually do, comes down to dividing a decision into three areas, what I rather fancifully call a trichotomy, a division into three. No permit required, a permit required, and prohibited. These are really, really important because here is the point, and it's kind of a point in time in some sense, where the planners or the people administering the planning scheme have the most power in our form of statutory planning. Why would I say they've got the most power? Because they have ability to influence outcomes. So they might already have decided, well, we don't want you, we don't even think you need to apply if it complies with the planning scheme. So it's a dwelling in a general residential zone with no overlays on a large site, just do it. You'll also need to comply with building, but we're not talking about building here, we're dealing with urban planning. What do you think, number 2 there, permit required means? What's the real point of permit required, do you think? I pause here because for most planners, most of the time, this is most of the work, permit required. It's a big deal in the system. What would the permit required bit be there for? Yes, bang on. They must submit an application. Can I ask that we go another step? Why is it that we're asking for an application? That's right. So we want to measure it against the planning scheme. We want to apply the tests of the planning scheme. But can't we tell with no permit required and prohibited? Why do we land in that middle bit, do you think? Yeah, I can't find the voices source somewhere here. Hand up. Oh, yeah, there you are. Number 156. I'll add a personal touch. Yeah, so a case-by-case basis, what's that mean?
Like look at it contextually and see if it fits.
Absolutely right. So we're saying, well, some things we're pretty certain in advance they fit in. And some things we're pretty sure in advance that they're never going to be allowed. But there's other things that we want to know that they fit into the context or the nature of the development or the land use, the activity on the land needs to be considered in the context. Not all planning systems do this. The Victorian planning system does this kind of on steroids in some ways, creates a lot of work. I guess maybe we should say that's a good thing. It also creates a whole bunch of angst as well. So we're going to talk more about this as we go through today and indeed next week as well. But in that extended moment of permit required, there's lots of ability for negotiation, for fine-tuning, for gathering evidence, for thinking about whether or not a thing should go ahead at any given time. So when we get down to, in a sense, the engine room, the power, it comes down to all those policies, all those zones, all those overlays, boiling down to that. So let's have a think about no permit required. Sometimes we call it as of right, as in there's a right to do that. If what is proposed aligns with the zone or the overlay, just off you go. Often there are low impact things that could occur, and indeed if we required a permit for everything, there would never be enough resources in the planning system to be able to process them all. And of course we don't want to slow down applicants, and we don't want to give ourselves jobs about things we've already decided. Okay, so the other aspect to this, sometimes we have something called existing use rights. In the second half of this semester we'll dig into that a bit more in the legal sense, but the main idea is that something was occurring before the planning scheme even existed or before the planning scheme was changed. An example might be a textile factory that occurred and it might have been in 1890 or something it started working, and many of these actually kept operating continuously until the 1980s. There aren't many left now, but I'm sure you've seen them if you've spent any time in inner city Melbourne, often a red brick or warehouse structure, and there they are, and they've got this industrial chic now because they've sort of been modified, often a sawtooth top to let light penetrate, often facing to the south for ambient light. And even when the planning schemes were first introduced in the 1950s, they were not compliant. Many of them around this area, there's huge focuses in the inner city of industrial land uses. But we couldn't just come along afterwards and say, we've changed the zone, you have to nick off, remembering in this country, like many others, that property rights are kind of rules supreme or nearly supreme. So they have what's called existing use rights, and we'll look into the detail of that because sometimes it's a tricky area. But essentially, if you're already doing something, the planning system doesn't come along and tell you to go away very easily. So there's some nuances with that. So they, in a sense, have Section 1 rights as well. And indeed, there might be other things in other parts of the planning system that also provide the ability to do things without a permit. The classic one is mining, and this is a hugely contentious area. It might be exploration, as in putting drill holes down or taking samples, and often they can do things that cut across a whole bunch of other rights, including planning rights. Any of you from Victoria, and in fact probably the rest of Australia, will know about this Shut the Gate campaign that tries to keep mineral exploration and mining off people's private land. But in fact, the Planning Act deliberately excludes, along with the Mining Act and Exploration Act, you've got no rights, you have to let them in, or they just cut the wire or whatever on your gate. And here's another great example of how a lot of our systems express the values of the government, or the government which passed legislation. because many, many years ago, and this is part of Australia's European history, we as a people in aggregate, not necessarily individuals, decided that it was worthwhile making sure that minerals under the ground were not locked up, and we didn't stop people mining because there's money in it. And royalties also flow to the government. Whatever you think of that, the current legislation allows it. And it would be actually a very brave government, even though they say they like the environment and people's rights, they still like the money from mineral exploration more, based on the evidence that we have before us for this kind of unbroken ability for mining to go through. And it cuts across the planning system as well. So, no permit required. We're trying to cut down on time, money, duplication, and trying to make sure that not everyone needs a permit all the time. I think I've kind of answered my question there. So that's section 1. Permit required. A lot of things are permit required, meaning, like the lady at number 156 and indeed others rightly pointed out, that we want you to apply, you've got to submit certain information, and we're going to look at it more carefully. And basically it's going, we never think about that. Does it fit in? Does it work? And a key phrase that we have is the trigger for permit. Sounds slightly frightening, this whole, guns and weapons thing, but it does to little old me here in Australia with strong gun laws. But it's a common phrase, what is the trigger for permit? And if you learn one thing in this course that is hugely useful to you, whatever role you play, we need to go looking for what triggers the need for a permit, as well as what's as of right and what's prohibited. Because if there's no trigger for permit, it means you've got as of right use. You can just go ahead and do stuff. It's really, really powerful. So it's a common thing you'll hear in council, in the tribunal, and so forth. So you go looking first in the zone, and I'll show you how to do that more specifically. Section 2 means you need a permit, and you might get one, you might not. Section 1 means go ahead. But here's a question for you to ponder, and I'll leave it with you. You will definitely need to know this. What happens if the use is in Section 2, permit required, but if you look down the zone provisions, they have conditions against each of the land uses that may or may not trigger a need for a permit. So what happens if you've got a Section 2 use, but it doesn't meet the condition? Go looking for what that means. So that's what we used to in the bad old days called the use class tables, but it's the first part really of the zone provisions. Have a look there. And really what that's doing, it's fine-tuning the land use according to the place. It's another fine-tuning exercise. So I won't try and explain it now, but go looking for that. See what it means. I haven't put here prohibited, but of course prohibited means no, you cannot have a dwelling in one of the more serious industrial zones, or other various things. Again, go looking at them and consider what they really mean and find the logic in there. I think there's a fair bit of logic in a statutory plan as well, at least, in how these zones trigger the need for a permit or prohibited or as of use. So go looking for that stuff. Okay. The other part of the planning scheme that can trigger the need for a permit is an overlay. So again, you have to go looking for those triggers. A heritage overlay might trigger the need for a permit if you do certain things to a structure. For instance, you might try and demolish it or modify it or changes external appearance and so forth. I won't go into the detail here, but when you read through both the heritage overlay and the schedule to the overlay, remembering that the heritage overlay is essentially generic across all of Victoria, the schedule is specific to the place. So the planning scheme seeks to have these rather generic controls, but then through mapping and through schedules to fine-tune them, to some extent at least, to particular places. And you'll see in the mapping for the heritage overlay, some of it covers the whole municipality occasionally, or it might be one individual site, or it might be one little neighbourhood, and so forth. So what you've got to think of yourself as when you're in statutory planning mode is what are the permit triggers, and what do they really mean? So heritage overlay is just one of them. It might be design and development overlay, it might be the bushfire management overlay, and so forth. They're all there to try and tell you, if they're in existence, that there's something going on this site, and we would like to know whether you comply. So bushfire management overlay, if that's covering a piece of land, it means, well, we've done mapping and we've identified that there's probably a bushfire risk here. When we go and look at it, we'll require you to do a detailed assessment. And the response must respond to that assessment. So it might be relatively low and will impose a fairly low standard of need of bushfire attack level. Or we might go and have a look and go, wow, this is really dangerous. We're going to impose a bushfire attack level of 40 or flame zone. Sorry, it's expensive, but we need to make sure people aren't going to die. So that's the other thing about overlays. Particular provisions can sometimes require a permit for specific things that might need to occur or might occur on the land. One of the classics I've used here is an example where an increase in parking demand might be triggered, that's the wrong word, might be caused by changing the land use. So it might have been a warehouse in the past. Now I want to have an office on the land. Which one do you think would typically require the most parking? Office, bang on. Not universally, but generally speaking, warehouses, lots of storage. Imagine a carpet warehouse, lots of storage and all kinds of stuff. People don't even come there to buy it. It's for sending out to retailers. A few people might need to park there because they work there or whatever. Generally speaking, though, it doesn't generate a huge demand for car parking. If it's an office, we can pack people in, one per 5 square metres sometimes in offices. And in some locations, people want to drive their cars there. So if you go and look at 5206, that's the clause in the planning scheme, you will see that there are certain requirements for a permit, and that generally speaking, there are certain ratios per floor space that must be met. So that's one example. Outdoor advertising, native vegetation removal, or heliport. Back in 1999, I had a client who wanted to build a heliport. And he said to me, I put this here to shame myself. He said to me, I'd like to build a heliport. It's near Pier 35 on the Yarra River. Do I need a permit? I said, no, you can just go ahead and build it, just building controls. And then a few days later, I had someone who knew I was working on that project from whatever the State Planning Commission was called then, Department of Infrastructure it was, in 99. They said, your client's building a heliport without a permit. I went and had a look, and they changed the bloody planning scheme, hadn't they? Because at this time, heliports were just mushrooming up everywhere, and it was starting to drive this. At the same time, there was a huge drive for inner city dwellings. So this was when people were starting to live in the inner city again. And all of a sudden they're saying, oh, it's lovely living here, but a whole bunch of things are driving me insane. Garbage trucks, not enough car parking, heliports and so forth. So what did the minister do at the time? He introduced a new clause in the planning scheme saying you need a permit for a heliport. And then I was rather embarrassed and did some scuttling around and made sure I got them a permit for that. So you need to actually go looking through the particular provisions whether or not things need a permit. So it doesn't necessarily come to you easily to work these things out. You do need to dig through for certain things. Whoops. Beg your pardon. Okay, so I would encourage you to get the hang of what those particular provisions mean and understand why, in terms of the rationale, that might be the case. Here's the other big thing you should remember and understand, because I'll definitely ask lots of questions about this. The triggers for permit required are directly related to the decision guidelines. So if you go and have a look at the heliport requirement in particular provisions, it says a permit must be, a permit is required for a heliport. And then you go down a smidgen and it'll say decision criteria. What do you reckon some of the decision criteria are for a heliport? Have a stab. Have a guess. Airspace, yeah, has to be able, yeah, there's associated legislation, but bang on for the Civil Aviation Act. What else? Noise and impacts on surrounding uses. That's right, they're the main ones. There's actually not much. But, you know, so if there was an existing, say, childcare centre and the kids are out there playing outside, would you really want a helicopter taking on, you know, starting up and landing and blowing dust everywhere and things going in their eyes? Hopefully you're saying no. So you've got to go looking for what is the trigger for permit. You've got to go looking for what the decision criteria are. These are super important because what they're doing, they're saying to the responsible authority, which is allocated by the Act as a role, usually of local government, but it's generally a town planner who has to work through this and write a report about it. Should it get a permit or not? And the primary reasons for whether or not something gets a permit go back to the decision criteria for the thing that triggered the need for the permit. It's kind of fundamental to this whole statutory process. I'll show you more of those, but I'll keep going through things. So you go looking for what is a trigger for permit, you go looking for what the decision criteria are. This is basic fundamental skill and it's kind of always there. So for example, heritage provisions require that heritage aspects of development or works be considered. If it's for use, the decision criteria are around use of something. So this is super important as well. We've got a concept called ultra vires. Who knows what ultra vires mean? I'm sure a few of you have studied Latin. Beyond power. Who was that? Yes. Looks like you're having a snack at the same time as saying that. I love the multitasking. Beyond power. It's really important because if the trigger for permit, let's say, was development, you can only make decisions about that proposal on the basis of development. You can't make decisions on the basis of the activity, the land use, that is occurring there. Really, really important. So they get separated out in this planning system. Some mix them up a bit, but Victoria deliberately separates them out. So let's have a think about it. You might want to build... No, let's go simple, Alan. If it's use alone, you might want to change the land use of a building to a restaurant, and you're not going to do any building or any development, any modification of the structure at all. All you're applying for is a change of use. And it previously was, let's say, an office. The first thing I'd think of is there a requirement under clause 5206 for car parking changes? Right, that's one thing. And then there might be some stuff in the local LPPF about amenity in the area. And you're thinking, oh, you know, they'll be out the back making noise at all hours. And there's residential stuff next door. I'm going to make them build a big wall or even enclose it. But you can't, because the application is only for the use. So you can't incur ultra vires, outside powers, conditions on whether or not they get a permit or your reasons for even refusing it. What you can do is include in your decision or your conditions things that relate to land use. So you might say, I'm a bit worried about the noise and amenity impacts of this new restaurant. I'll modify the opening hours, and because that's about land use. So that maybe it seems a bit complicated now. We'll sort of repeat this again and again as we go through. But use, you're allowed to say when it's used, for example. And you might put restrictions on, you know, you have to, it's not allowed to operate as a restaurant after 11 p.m. It's quite a common thing that we do. So these distinctions are super important. So we've got a bit of a series of things we do here, haven't we? What's the trigger for permit? What are the decision criteria for the trigger for permit? And is it use or development as we go through? And as you start working through zones and overlays, it actually becomes fairly obvious at some point. But if you feel a bit all at sea right now, don't worry, as we go through, you'll get it. What happens at the end of a permit required process? It's probably a bit obvious. Now I've got it up there. They might get a permit. They might get a permit with conditions that modify what they're allowed to do, hopefully not in an ultra vires way. Or they might get a refusal. Occasionally people say, oh, actually I crunched the numbers and I can't make money out of this, I'll just withdraw it or abandon it. Because it's not just the permit process, it's the real world of making money or having enough money, or maybe you just change your mind and say, I don't want to be a restaurateur, I want to be a painter, you know, whatever it might be. So these run right the way through, and it's a statutory process as set out in the Act of the steps we need to go through and the powers that the responsible authority has at its disposal, that some things, as in permit, once it starts being processed, you can issue that. I will say it is kind of rare, or perhaps doesn't even ever happen, that there's a permit without conditions, primarily because every single permit must have a time limit on it. As in, if they don't begin acting on a permit, it lapses usually after 2 years. And another typical condition that's on a permit is that once you commence building, you must finish building within 2 years. It can be modified for large projects. Why do you think those two conditions are standard conditions on a permit? So the first one is you must commence within 2 years, and the second one is once you've commenced, you must complete it within 2 years if you get a permit. Why would we impose that? Absolutely bang on. So we recognise that in a dynamic, changeable city, circumstances might change, and the government of the day or the local authority might change its understandings of what is desirable or not desirable in a given location. So context might change. So a permit is, so a developer says, worth a lot of money. And if they don't act on it, that actually lapses. So you might be able to get a permit for a multi-story tower block in one time period. The next time period you might not be able to, because in that area there's developed local opposition to it, or perhaps more sensitive land uses come in, or perhaps there's a whole change to the VPPs and we think about these things differently. Just like my example of not needing a permit for a heliport, then it changes, you know. So, so these things are pretty important. But during this permit required process, it provides local government with the ability to negotiate. It must be about planning matters. They can't say, give us, $100 a week for lunch or something, although I'm sure people have tried. We don't have a huge amount of corruption in the system. I know there is some occasionally. But what it means, you can say, we don't really think your design fits in with this local heritage streetscape. So we're unlikely to give you a permit unless you change the kind of materials that you're using that might fit in with the predominant brick pitched roof, area, that the context that you're in. And you can negotiate those things, particularly say if it's in a heritage overlay, and some of the criteria take you to those considerations. But I can tell you one thing, once you issue a permit, all the power of the planning system is over. The decision's been made. So this moment, this extended moment of considering a permit application is really, really important for all of the parties that are involved. So what's the point of a permit? Obviously, as I've pointed out to you, the Act encourages us achieving certain objectives: prosperity, environmental sustainability, fairness, etc. But the big assumption in the Planning and Environment Act is that generally we're encouraging development, if it roughly fits in. And that is contentious, I suspect, to many of us. So the point of this process is if it's generally a good idea, we'll give it a permit on balance. But right next to that is to allow the possibility that we could say, no, it's not good enough. Because you only get one chance. Once the permit's issued and once the thing is built or the activity occurs, off they go. And you might be living with it for 100 years or more. It's gone. The opportunity to improve that, to make sure it's proper architecture or doesn't cut down trees unnecessarily or whatever the considerations are. So it's an important little moment in time. Cities, according to this statutory view of the world, are built incrementally, decision upon decision. And Melbourne's a great example of that. The city we've got is based on a whole bunch of individual decisions writ large. So permitting processes are super important in that respect. Responsible authorities can negotiate. The potential to say no is a really big deal, but also there can be conditions on a permit. I haven't really explained this in great detail, and we'll look at some conditions over the next couple of weeks, but basically it could be that a permit is granted for the use as dwellings for a 10-storey tower block, subject to the following conditions. And one of those conditions might be that the exterior is painted a certain colour, that extra car parking is provided, that certain window treatments occur to stop overlooking, or that trees are planted to make sure it contributes to local amenity, and so forth. And these, when a condition on a permit exists, it's legally enforceable. So this is quite a powerful component of the planning permit process. It can significantly improve things. Sometimes it might actually provide such a burden on the developer that they won't go ahead. And that's just how it is. But the potential for conditions is quite powerful. The other thing is that it allows integration and coordination with other agencies. So You might recall at the start of this lecture series I talked about one of the purposes of planning is coordination between different parties. So a good example is that during the process of a permit application process, a copy of the application has to be sent out to other agencies or parties. An example I think I used with you guys before was VicRoads. VicRoads, in simple terms, is the larger, busier arterial roads. Lots of volume of traffic going up and down, and a real need to keep them busy and working if you're in that sort of road building mindset. So I might be trying to build on the edge of a busy freeway and have a new entrance coming in and out. It gets sent off to VicRoads and they say, we disagree with that. We don't want a new entrance and exit on this busy road because cars going in and out will be dangerous and will slow the main road down. So they can impose a condition on a permit. It's one example of an attempt to coordinate. There's many other examples. It could be the Country Fire Authority having an opinion about fire risk. It could be a catchment agency talking about their potential impacts on the quality of water and runoff, and so on and so forth. Electricity agencies are another one. So there's heaps. So this conditioning can also play an important role through referrals for coordination in the planning system. We'll have a break in a few minutes, guys. And the other thing is that even though we have fairly generic zones and fairly generic overlays, the permitting process allows us to ask questions that are specific to a place. So local neighbourhood character, that's not going to be the same all the time, is it? There's going to be the qualities of gardens, of setbacks, of the nature of construction, the style, how it was modified over time, and all that sort of stuff. You can only really work that out through a process like a permit process where you say, okay, they want to build that there, and go and look at the place and no, that doesn't fit in. But if you chop one story off and change the roof pitch and the window dimensions, you know, so it allows you to contextualise things that are being proposed. So, one of the things about urban planning is that most of the time we are talking about dynamic change and we're talking about process. I would add to the things I've written there, decisions. And Stephen Rowley's book talks about these a little bit. There's a previous book from 2012 by Eccles and Bryant that talks about deciding to plan and deciding to implement. You know, when you boil it all down, planning is trying to use a good evidence base to make decisions about what the future should look like and whether or not people's attempts to do things fit into that general vision. So the permit process is kind of a series of decisions, isn't it? Hopefully those individual decisions add up to good cities or regions or towns, etc. So when you look at these, they're actually pretty important in our kind of planning system. We don't master plan too much. You know, we allow developers to have a fair bit of scope, but we don't let them do whatever they like. You know, so the permitting process is absolutely fundamental. And in many ways, it's trying to find a little sweet spot, a little balance between letting the market do its thing with still achieving bigger goals, trying to protect ecological things, trying to achieve equity. You know, I think some things we don't do very well at all, like equitable outcomes. It's pretty hard to do through a statutory system. It doesn't really work that well. So that's kind of challenging. So it breaks down to those three things. So what's a typical process? Let me just remind myself, yeah. So I won't go through this in detail today. I'll do that with an example next week. But we'll go through with the Act in one hand and understand these processes if you've lived in Melbourne for any length of time, you've probably had something to do, and possibly a lot to do, with these processes of making decisions about whether or not something gets a permit. So, okay, I'll stop there. Quick break, let's say 5 minutes. Let's make it 25 past, and we'll have a quick little burst and then another part of the drawing exercise. So 25 past, guys, thank you. Okay, so as I said, this is the general process you would need to learn for permits. You won't be doing it in a completely abstract way because all of those steps come out of the Act. We won't go through that today. I just want you to know that that's the process that sits behind a lot of this, and it forms the basis for the permit required or refused components to this process. But one of the other things the Act does is it sets out responsibilities and powers to a range of different parties. And one of the things that the responsible authority is required to do, and you might want to go there, I won't sort of switch back and forth between the lecture and the Act right now, but you might want to have it in front of you if you choose. But you'll see that under Section 58, the responsible authority must consider every, I've shortened it there, every valid or legal permit application. They can't say, oh, I don't like the look of you, or I know you're a criminal and serve time in prison, or whatever they might say. The law says in the Planning and Environment Act, they must consider every permit application if it's complete and if it's not prohibited. One of the fundamental principles under the Planning and Environment Act is natural justice and fairness to all parties if they do things legally. So sometimes this is assumed, sometimes it is set out quite specifically. So there's been a long-standing concern with planning systems around the world with the question of whether or not there's corruption or unfairness or whatever. This is important, and it contrasts directly with the profession of urban planning having at its very heart ideas of social justice, equity, the environment, as well as prosperity and these other things, public health. So this is in here in a very deliberate way, like a lot of the other things in the planning scheme. So recall that, but also recall, as you learn this material and think on it and read the words and interpret them, that we as statutory planners, I realise there are other types of planners out there, but we've got our statutory planners hats on now. If someone says, why do I have to accept that application? That guy's an idiot. It's a stupid proposal. Well, as a statutory planner, you need to know, well, actually, there's a source of truth, so to speak, there. It's written in the Act. Okay, now you don't have to know every single detail, but there are key things that you need to go and find. Oh, I don't remember the section number, but I kind of know it's in there. That's a pretty important planning skill. So what we're doing in this lecture series is trying to expose you to the main ones, but also getting you used to the idea of going looking for these things, because I think it was probably on one of my first days on the front counter of a local authority. You know, I got asked all these questions. I realised very quickly you kind of have to point the developer to the thing that says, you know, industrial use next to kindergarten prohibited. Look, it says it there. You know, they want to know. So this kind of thinking is sort of part of it. Or why? You know, and it's quite valid that people ask that. We need to be able to point them to that. And if we don't know, we find out. So the other thing under section 47 there, if an application comes in, certain key things must be provided, because you can't make a decision, a proper decision, because that's what the Act's trying to get us to do, without relevant information. The fee and other information required by the scheme that typically requires maps and plans as appropriate to what's being proposed, and then all of the information that is required to be met by the decision criteria. So if it's about amenity, information about amenity. If it's about overshadowing, drawings showing the overshadowing. If it's about car parking, how you calculated the car parking, and so forth. This is important because if that's not contained, you're not meant to accept the application. Or if you do accept it, then there are processes I'll talk about later where you can stop the process and ask for that to come. Until it comes, you hold that process. The other thing is that there must be a register of applications. This is so each application has a unique identifier that is tracked right through the process. The register must be kept publicly available. This is also in the interests of transparency and information exchange. And you can work out at any time what is being proposed, find out information about it, etc. So back in the bad old days, we had one of those file things, you know, those sort of round things with flips on them. That was always on the front counter. Now, of course, you can just look it up on the internet. There might be some old councils out there in the country that still use the paper system. That must be there, and it gets that unique identifier. The unique identifier is typically something like TP for town planning, 2018-1, 2, and it just sequentially goes up. But it also has on there what's being proposed, who's the applicant, you know, and so forth. That basic information you might need. The other one, every application must be made available for the public. Every single one. So nothing secret can go on. So if I were to go to the front counter and say, I'd like to see this application, and they say you can't see it, well, I'd say, well, I'm afraid you're breaking the law. Because it says at section 51, I must be, you know, you've got to be reasonable. You can't say right here, right now, you know, but in a reasonable period of time. And then another one that is directly linked to that, notice must be given to various parties of an application, notably those who might suffer material detriment under section 52, part 1D. What do you think material detriment might be? No, it's about the only one that's not. Except in some particular circumstances where it's at a community level. So that was financial. It's a perfect one to bring up though, because we tend to exclude competition and financial impact, because if we took it into account, we'd never make a decision. And there's another assumption in the Planning Act that is kind of businesses and people's financial matters, look after yourself. Sounds a bit brutal. So that's a good one to identify as not typically involved. What are some things that would possibly be involved? I heard something up there. It's right up there. Public uses. So impacts on a park. Yeah, that would be valid. Yep. What are some other ones?
Your front lawn being turned into a road.
If it was on your land, property law would cover you. Unless it was being resumed, then through the Land Acquisition Act you could object. In the Planning Act that sort of doesn't happen too often. If there was a major road directly adjacent to your land being proposed, you would certainly have grounds for objection there because of amenity. Noise, vibration, fumes, etc. So amenity is a whole category. Overshadowing, read your mind. Overshadowing is, these are all considerations. They don't make or break necessarily, but it's that I might have a lovely veggie garden and a lawn where the kids play out the back or whatever, and that could be considered potentially a material detriment, something that's bad for me, effectively. Okay, so pretty much anything is possibly in the mix, except for the financial impacts. The only time we take financial impact into account is when the overall community might suffer from something. So things like the pokies coming in, the gambling machines, or things like there's one shopping centre in town and it's only just making money. If we let another one in, the whole thing might fall down and we won't have any shops. So things like that sometimes come into account. So basically it's, or it might be that I consider that there's not enough car parking here already. I don't have a car park myself, I rely on the street, and this new development will mean there's not enough car park for everyone, car park on the street. So this is not to say this stops things, but it's part of the consideration process. So that's material detriment. The other key thing, I talked here about applications being complete. If it turns out upon closer inspection that more information is needed to be able to make a decision about an application, the responsible authority is allowed under section 54 to request further information. So they can say, there's a requirement for an urban design study as part of the design and development overlay. We don't think your study is comprehensive enough. You must provide us with all of the information in an urban design sense about what your proposal is going to do. And further, under section 54, which I suggest you look at with some care, it stops the clock. This is a phrase we use to indicate that the 60-day period for making a decision has stopped because the applicant hasn't provided all the information that would support making a decision. So we call that stopping the clock. It's set out in the regulations that are associated with the Act under the head of power set by section 54. So some people say responsible authorities use that section 54 power to just because they're getting behind. Maybe that's true sometimes. On the whole, it's there for a very good reason, that there's not enough information to make a good decision. The other thing I was talking about before was coordination between different agencies, and this is what section 55 provides for, that it requires that certain parties be informed that there's an application. And so that's the Country Fire Authority or Vic Roads or the relevant telecommunications company and so forth, just in case what is being proposed might have an impact on their goals.
Is that always the responsibility of the fire agency?
Yes, it is in this respect, yeah, because it's triggered through the responsible authority's role. That's right, yep. Sometimes the minister might have taken on the responsible authority role, and in that case he or she would have to send it off for referrals at that time.
But it's never the responsibility of that.
Sometimes the responsible authority might ask the applicant to do it. I think that's becoming pretty unusual these days. I can't think of it happening for ages, actually. Yeah, I can't think of an instance, unless you know of one, I can't think of when that would happen. Okay, so sometimes things don't need any referrals, other times there are heaps of them because they're complex. And here's the thing that you'll hear about a lot if you're involved in the planning system in Victoria, is that any person who may be affected may object under section 57. So if there's a tower block going up at the end of my street, or in fact in another suburb altogether, if I think that will have an effect on me or on the interests of Victorians or on the workings of the planning scheme, I have the right to make an objection at any time before the responsible authority makes a decision. For it to have force, it must be in writing. And for it to have any real power, it needs to address the criteria of the planning scheme. And most of all, it needs to recognise what the trigger for permit was and use the decision criteria that directly relate to the trigger for permit. Okay, so that is always this fundamental turning point. So if I object because, to follow the gentleman's example there, if I object because the new shopping centre is going to take away business and I'll lose money, unless it's a very unusual case, that's not a consideration that the planning scheme includes. And that objection would just be, oh yeah, he lodged that, but we're ignoring it. Whereas, if I pointed out that the new road proposed goes onto a major road and it'll cause traffic dangers and things like that because it's not well designed, then that would be taken into account. Or if I talked about the heritage overlay criteria not being met in this really sensitive area, then that would be taken into account if it was in that overlay. So, most of us who have lived in Victoria for a little while have had something to do with an objection, or our parents or friends have, and we have extensive rights to object. Doesn't mean things are necessarily stopped, but what it means is that the responsible authority must consider it. The word consider is an important one because it means take into account in your professional judgment. Balance it off. And the primary thing against which you're balancing it is the planning scheme and indeed underneath the Act itself with its overall objectives. So, whatever I think personally, the real test against which things are being considered is the planning scheme most of the time and the particular triggers. So I know I'm sort of going on about that a bit, but it's kind of what the planning scheme is and how it works. So any objections that have come in, I must also consider them. Any referral authority comments to saying, well, look, you're trying to build in a higher risk bushfire area. We require it to be bushfire attack level 40 on the permit because it's really dangerous, or flame zone. And any other impacts. So this is quite a powerful component of the planning scheme. It's quite contentious. Any referral authority comments must be taken into account. Objections, they are there mainly to indicate that, have you thought about this? Did you realise that floods every year? Did you know that ground was contaminated? Generally speaking, the planning officers will just consider those against the main criteria they use. But the other thing is, if something becomes very contentious, the objections go to the elected councillors, and they might actually be influenced by objections. Whereas for planning officers, for essentially technical and professional people, they will say, oh, good point, yeah, I didn't know that was the place where that famous person lived, and it might add something to the heritage overlay, but they're still using the main bits of the planning scheme. Whereas politicians might be influenced by those. A change that occurred about 7 years ago is now that we must require social or economic effects, although I will say that is not particularly well used yet. I think we're still trying to get the hang of that one. Okay, and again, just in a reinforcing way, what happens at the end of this process when all of this extra information comes in? Grant a permit with conditions, or refuse to, under section 61(1). The process is that if someone objected to an application, the responsible authority must issue a notice of decision. talk about this again next week, so don't worry if it doesn't come together straight away. But what it means is that if people objected, the responsible authority cannot immediately decide to issue a permit. Instead, they have to tell everyone who objected that they mean to issue a permit, that they're going to. And what this provides is an opportunity for objectors to take it to the next step, which is a formal appeal process, if they choose to do so. They get 21 days to do that, but I'll set that out in detail next week. But the main thing I've written here is that it gives them the right to appeal. We have quite a complicated process in this way. In Victoria, lots of rights to object, lots of rights to appeal. It makes things slower. However, I would also argue that I think it generally makes us come to better decisions, even though it takes longer and might cost people money, because all of the different arguments are thrashed through. Everyone gets to have a say. The decisions aren't usually based on weight of numbers, but hopefully professional thinking in the council officer's report and the tribunal, not always the politicians, because all of the arguments are well exercised, and the idea behind this is if we know absolutely everything, then we can balance everything out. There won't be something that's been left aside, hasn't been argued. So you might have opinions about that. So this is taking us into the territory of appeals, or what more formally we're meant to call reviews of decisions. And different parties have different rights of appeal. So an applicant can appeal against a refusal or on the conditions on their permit. If I'm an objector, I can appeal against the grant of a permit. And other parties might appeal on the basis of a defect of procedure, how they move through the process, like they didn't advertise it when they were meant to advertise it, if they didn't tell anyone that it was happening, or the time limits were not used properly, or so forth. And then it takes us to a separate body or agency, which is VCAT, the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal. I'll go for about 5 minutes. The idea of VCAT, it used to be called the Administrative Tribunal, the AAT. So if you look up old cases, you'll see it under AAT. And before that, it was the TPB, the Town Planning Board. The idea of the tribunal is not to go to a court, to a formal court with lawyers, etc., although we do get lawyers in the tribunal, but rather to try and make it a slightly less expensive, less intimidating and less legalistic process that tries to come back to making decisions that are solution-based, not decisions that you're wrong, you've got to pay a penalty and start again, but rather, okay, we're looking at everything on balance and we still think a permit should issue, but we're going to change it a bit like this. So it's meant to be more of a professional problem-solving place, the tribunal. I would encourage you in the next couple of weeks to go and have a look at one and see what you think. But one of the questions is that as time passes, more and more applications are being decided at the tribunal because we can't make a decision at local government level. And it does take longer and it can be more expensive. On the whole, however, these tend to be the big developments and the contentious ones that go there. So, I guess a debate I'm flagging here is, does the existence of VCAT as an appeal process devalue local democracy? Because the decision-making process at local government level is curtailed and it goes up to a higher authority. So why are we having local democracy in the background? So you might want to go. In fact, I'd strongly recommend it. You're not required to, you're not assessed on it necessarily. But if you want to understand this, you can go to 55 King Street in the CBD, in the centre of Melbourne. That's up the west side of the grid, sort of on the south corner, not far from Southern Cross Station. and anyone is allowed to go and see a tribunal decision. There are certain rules of conduct in the tribunal. I have to say, I guess I'm a planning geek. I love them because when they're conducted well, it's a really interesting way of finding a version of the truth, I suppose. If you want to go and see one, I'd recommend looking up, what's on the next day on the internet, on VCAT's website. And if you do go, choose one, unless you want to spend a long period of time there, choose one that is likely to be scheduled just for an afternoon or a morning. And so you can see the entirety of it. Once a month they have the, what do they call it, Fast Fridays, where they try and see more simple cases fairly quickly. So that might be something to see. But if you do go to one, talk to the clerks there and just say, I'd like to see this, I'm studying urban planning and planning law, can I sit in? And you'll go in, and often what will happen is the tribunal member might just ignore you, or they might say, who are you, what do you want? And if you just say, I'm studying planning law, can I sit in? They will definitely say, yes please, sit over there, and they might say, shut up. So, you would not want to get involved because they have the right to conduct proceedings, and that part of that means you be quiet or you leave. I don't think any of you are likely to do that. And you're meant to stand up when they come into the room, answer questions or directions of theirs as appropriate. But generally you can just sit there and be quiet and listen. And you'll see that there are different roles being played. Applicant, the responsible authority, objectors, expert witnesses, advocates. Some of those people will be barristers, town planners, architects, etc. If you see one of the more contentious cases, it's actually pretty fascinating how arguments are built and cross-examination occurs and things like that. So I'll talk more about that, and in the second half of the semester we'll talk more about VCAT quite directly with our barrister friends. But I wanted to sort of highlight and show here that participation and indeed the involvement of other parties is a big part of the planning permit process. It's written into the Act in many locations, and in one way you can think, okay, people have a right to object or a right to appeal. Does it make things better or not? I have my own opinions, but perhaps you should think of your own. These are the sorts of questions that I would raise in an exam question, for example, because it demonstrates that you understand the underlying process, but then perhaps what are the implications of these processes, and I will reward people who have an opinion. It doesn't have to match my opinion, but a reasoned and plausible reasoning for their opinion on things. They're the people we give good marks to, generally speaking. Because we're not just robots learning something here, we're professionals with an opinion about a planning system that is periodically reviewed and we can have inputs to. So, if you let lots of people have opinions and get involved, are they actually serving the interests of wider Victorians or the planet, ecological matters, or are they just self-interest? It's a complicated question to separate that out. Are planners actually making decisions and having a real role, or is it just a legal process? Is it all too expensive? Some of these applications take a year due to objections and VCAT tribunal hearings, or even longer. If you're a developer and you have those holding costs for that long, that's a huge amount of money. Is it worth it? Something you might want to think of. And is VCAT stopping things? Or perhaps conversely, has it made local democracy less relevant? So there's a bunch of questions there. Very quickly, some other things that are part of the responsible authority's role is enforcement. If people are not complying with the planning scheme, as in they're conducting an illegal land use or illegal development, the responsible authority must enforce that. in the Act, and they can seek an enforcement order. They can try to stop or punish breaches. Normally we start off gently, saying, did you realise that conducting a shop in your front room with all that extra car parking is actually illegal? Please stop. If they keep doing it, maybe we'll take an enforcement action and eventually issue a penalty. Generally the planning system tries to be gentle at first. And it can go right through to a stop work order, and there can be costs awarded because of that. Or sometimes people might just not have known they need a permit. They can get a permit, let them go on and do their thing. A nearby example, if you're new to Melbourne, you probably haven't seen that because it was knocked down illegally by some developers. This is a notorious case. These guys knew they weren't meant to knock it down because they'd sought advice on it, so it's documented. They still knocked it down. I'm not sure what they were thinking, but I guess they thought they'd get away with it. The minister got involved, actions being taken against them. They're going to stand huge amounts of costs, but I think there will always be some people in the system that seek to get away with things. There are many examples. Some years ago, I saw this in the newspaper. A guy on this site here was an earth moving operator. On the weekends when all of his men were off work, he would use the equipment to build himself his own homemade canal, like a little marina. And sometimes they'd even pay his men if they didn't have another job to dig it for him. And no one noticed for quite some time, or they just thought someone's digging over there. And of course it came to light. He never would have been able to sell the land, so I don't know how he thought he was going to get away with it. But it contravenes a lot of things in the Planning Act, in the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act and so forth. But people will often try this stuff. He ended up with all kinds of costs for reinstatement and to fill it back in again. So there's actually, it's quite an entertaining history in its awful way. Couple more points to finish off for tonight. Compensation. Generally speaking, we don't give compensation for people when we change the rules of the planning system. So you might benefit or you might suffer, and the planning system pretty much says too bad. That's the reality of it, because it's actually quite hard to work out. So it might be zoned residential one day and commercial the other day. Sorry, too bad. But if land is compulsorily purchased or acquired, there can be compensation in that case. Generally speaking, that's dealt with in the land, I think what state I'm in, the Land Acquisition Act. I think that's what it's called nowadays. So it's not really dealt with in the Planning Act, the amount of compensation anyway. It's more of a property law process. So what you really need to remember is that the planning system doesn't really worry too much about costs and values being changed by its decision most of the time. The planning system can facilitate compulsory acquisition through overlays. So this is around Coburg, where land had been set aside in the past for roads over time. CityLink, some highway building can do that, but I have to say it doesn't happen very much in Australia because it's politically quite unpopular. There can be agreements under section 173 of the Act to change the certificate of title as part of a planning permit. We discourage this, but sometimes it's used because it might allow it's a way of adding conditions that have more permanency on a land title. You don't need to know too much about it. And I'll let you read these, and I would suggest that these are the sorts of things that you should look at when you're studying for the exam. So I know that's a way off yet, but I deliberately drop things that are more reflective. When you go back, you might want to think on those when you're looking over your notes studying for exams. These are the sorts of things that I'll want to know that you know to give marks out. And pointing out all the different players in the system. So, as I did last week, we'll stop the formal lecture here, but for the remaining 5 to 10 minutes, if anyone wants to stop, and I'll just mention a few things about reading drawings, you can stay behind. So very simple, looking at some scruffy diagrams, but just to learn a little bit more about reading drawings, dimensions, what's a section, what's an overlay, what's a plan view, etc. Anyone else can go. Oh, you've got a few minutes to get to the lecture. So thanks guys, see you next week. That's nice. Oh, oh, they're paying me for oh. You guys. Exactly, yeah.